No one alive today can say they have truly heard the voices of the first civilizations. No one remembers how their stories were first spoken. Not completely. Not clearly. Only fragments remain, soft impressions pressed into clay before history had a name. And yet, across 5,000 years of silence, one name continues to drift through the dust of time. The Anunnaki. Long before Egypt lifted its first stones, long before the earliest Chinese dynasties shaped the horizon, long before the Vedic hymns were carried on the winds of India, people living between two slow, wandering rivers whispered of beings who shaped the structure of their world. To them, the Anunnaki were not symbols, not allegories, not distant myths frozen in temple walls. They were presence, quiet, enduring, woven into the rhythm of rivers, the rise and fall of seasons, the coronation of kings, the soft breath of the night sky. Archaeologists have found thousands of tablets bearing their names. Hymns, legal codes, star charts, records of offerings, simple lists of grain, complex visions of the universe. Different tablets, different centuries, but always the same quiet idea that the world was watched, balanced, held together by an assembly whose hands were unseen but ever present. The Anunnaki were described as a council, a gathering, not loud, not chaotic, but deliberate, as calm as the slow turning of the moon. Even in the oldest tablets, there is no introduction, no moment of arrival, no tale of how they first appeared. They are simply there, fully formed, already powerful, already part of a cosmic order older than the cities that honored them. According to the early Sumerians, they descended from Anu, the high god of the endless sky. The word they used, Anunna, meant the offspring of An, or those who come from the heavens. And so, the Anunnaki were imagined not above the world, but between its layers, standing at the threshold where earth meets sky, where dust meets starlight. To the people of Mesopotamia, existence was not random. It moved with a pattern, soft, steady, predictable in its own quiet way. The rivers might flood, storms might come, drought might arrive like a long breath held too tightly. But beneath all of this, there was order, a rhythm older than the land itself, and the Anunnaki were the keepers of that rhythm. In Eridu, often called the first city on earth, temples were built again and again, on the same patch of sacred ground, not once, not twice, but 17 times across centuries, layer upon layer, brick upon brick, each new temple aligned to the sky, each foundation laid with the belief that the world above and the world below were quietly speaking to each other. Farther north, in Nippur, the spiritual heart of the land, the Sumerians imagined a hidden chamber, the Ubshu Ukina, where the Anunnaki gathered to decide destinies. They pictured no thunder, no flames, no shouting, only deliberation, only calm, only the slow, steady shaping of fate, the way the river shapes the banks along its path. In their world, each god had a role: wind, water, moon, sun, justice, harvest. And above them all stood a triad: Anu, the silent sky; Enlil, the breath of storms and authority; Enki, the deep water, wisdom, and the hidden places of the earth. The Anunnaki were their assembly, not rulers, but the structure behind rulership. To the Sumerians, this was not metaphor. Kings claimed their right to rule through these ancient beings. Priests offered food to maintain harmony. Astronomers mapped the heavens, believing they were reading the handwriting of the divine. Life unfolded, as if guided by hands just out of sight. And yet, for all their presence, the Anunnaki remain mysterious. They appear everywhere in the tablets, yet are never fully explained. They are spoken of as if everyone already knew them, as if their origins belonged to a time before writing, before memory, before the first brick of the first city was set into the earth. Later civilizations carried their echoes forward: Babylonian hymns, Assyrian inscriptions, Persian reinterpretations, Greek comparisons, Jewish and early Christian reflections on cosmic councils. Even today, their names pull gently at the imagination. not with fear, but with the quiet wonder that comes from glimpsing something ancient and unfinished. Because the Anunnaki represent the first moment humans ever tried to understand how the world works, not through chaos, not through violence, but through order, through structure, through the belief that existence itself has meaning woven into its fabric. And now, standing at the doorway of their story, what you feel is not revelation, but resonance, a soft recognition that long before our age of noise and rushing thoughts, people sat beneath open skies and wondered about the same mysteries we wonder about today. This is only the beginning. Before we go deeper into creation, into myth, into temples buried beneath sand, take a moment to support this channel. Your subscription gives us strength and helps us continue unfolding these ancient stories, one gentle breath at a time. And now, let the journey continue. And as we step gently past the threshold of their story, something subtle begins to unfold, a feeling, more than a thought, a slow settling of the mind, as if the ancient world itself were inviting you to walk a little deeper into its quiet corridors. Because to understand the Anunnaki is to understand a civilization that moved with a patience our modern world has forgotten. The Sumerians lived close to the earth, their days shaped by the river, their nights shaped by the stars, their lives shaped by the slow turning of seasons that came and went like long breaths of the land. And in this gentle rhythm, the Anunnaki were not distant beings. They were the pulse beneath everything, the quiet order behind the rise of crops, the calm breath behind the wind, the soft whisper behind the glow of the moon, reflected on still water. The people believed that every temple stone they placed was guided by divine memory. They believed that every ritual they performed was part of a cycle older than humanity itself. They believed that their world was a reflection of a cosmic pattern too large to see, but always present, like constellations hidden behind daytime sky. And that belief gave their lives a rare kind of steadiness. In the cool evenings, families gathered outside clay homes. As the last light faded from the horizon, the air softened, the desert winds slowed, and in that slow quiet, someone, an elder, a priest, a wandering storyteller, would begin to speak of the old days, the first days, the days when the gods themselves shaped the form of the world. No one rushed the story. No one leaned forward in suspense. The tale unfolded the way water unfolds across a plain, slowly, softly, finding its way into every listener's heart. Children would rest their heads against a parent's arm. Workers would relax their tired hands. The city around them would dim into shapes and shadows. And in that dimness, the world of the Anunnaki felt close enough to touch, not as beings of terror, not as kings demanding obedience, but as ancient presences woven into the breath of the night. And this is why their story continues to resonate. Because even now, thousands of years later, we recognize the feeling, a faint memory of stillness, a quiet sense that life once moved, at the pace of footsteps across cool sand, at the pace of stars drifting slowly across an endless sky. The Anunnaki lived in that rhythm, or rather, they were that rhythm, the quiet order that kept rivers within their banks, the silent mathematics hidden inside the movement of planets, the soft logic that shaped planting seasons, moon cycles, and the steady beating of human hearts. And though time carried civilizations forward, from Sumer to Akkad, from Akkad to Babylon, from Babylon to Assyria, the feeling remained, a whispered sense that the universe is not accidental, that existence is not a random scatter of events, that life unfolds along paths carved long before we arrived. The ancient people believed they were walking those paths, not alone, but accompanied, guided by beings whose presence was quiet enough to be missed, but constant enough to shape everything. And perhaps that belief brought them a kind of peace that we still seek today, a peace rooted not in certainty, but in acceptance. As we look back now, standing so far from their world, We can almost imagine the sound of the early cities settling into night, the hush of wind against mud-brick walls, the soft murmur of water in narrow canals, the distant echo of footsteps fading into silence. Night in Mesopotamia was not empty. It was full of stars, full of breath, full of the ancient pulse of the world, moving slowly beneath everything. And in that fullness, the Anunnaki were felt more deeply than any written story could describe. They lived in the way temples aligned, precisely with celestial markers. They lived in the way rituals echoed, the cycles of nature. They lived in the way kings took their vows, with bowed heads and slow, reverent gestures. Their presence was not a spectacle. It was a sensation, a calm awareness that life was part of something larger and endlessly patient. As we return to the present moment, sitting with these stories, in the quiet of our own time, something within us softens. These myths, shaped in a world of sand and starlight, still carry a unique kind of comfort, not because they claim to explain everything, but because they remind us that humanity has always searched for meaning behind the visible. And that search is as old as writing, as old as memory, as old as breath. As the gentle shadows of their world settle around you now, you might begin to feel the same calm the ancients felt, a calm that comes from imagining, a universe held together, not by chaos, but by quiet intention, a calm that comes from knowing that long before we were born, people sat beneath open skies and wondered the same things we wonder, a calm that comes from recognizing that the world is vast and ancient and full of patterns we are only beginning to see. And so, as you rest with this story, its soft edges, its slow rhythm, its gentle echoes drifting across time, let yourself breathe more deeply. Let your thoughts grow lighter. Let the night become a cradle for the oldest memories of our species. Because this journey into the world of the Anunnaki is not just a journey into the past, it is a journey inward, toward the quiet center of human curiosity, toward the place within us, where wonder first began. And now, as the path stretches forward into deeper myths, deeper temples, deeper reflections of an ancient mind, allow yourself to move gently with the story, unhurried, unburdened, guided by the same rhythm that guided the earliest civilizations, the rhythm of earth beneath sky, the rhythm of water carving stone, the rhythm of stars drifting in silence, and somewhere within that rhythm, the presence that the ancient people once called the Anunnaki. They did not begin their story with light. They did not begin with stars. They did not begin with a sky split open by divine command. In the earliest memories of Mesopotamia, creation begins with something far quieter and far heavier. It begins with labor, slow, unending, woven into the very dust of the world. Long before humans existed, the ancient texts say that the earth was already busy. The rivers had been guided into channels. The fields had been carved from wild soil. The foundations of sacred places had already taken shape beneath the early sun. But none of this had been done by human hands. It was the Agigi, a host of divine workers, who carried the weight of creation. Not gods of thunder, not rulers of celestial realms, but patient laborers who dug canals, lifted stones, deepened riverbeds, and maintained the world in the long, shadowed ages before memory. The tablets describe them working, year after year, cycle after cycle, in a rhythm that never changed. They rose with the dawn. They moved with the sun. They rested only when darkness folded gently over the land, until slowly, quietly, that rhythm began to break. At first, it was only a whisper, a small strain in the divine order. A sigh carried on the wind, a murmur settled among the ranks of the weary Igigi. Then, like a rising tide, their fatigue began to swell. It grew until it could no longer be ignored. And one day, in a moment that changed everything, the Igigi laid down their tools. They refused to lift them again. They gathered in silence, a silence more powerful than any shout, and the ancient balance trembled. The world paused. The higher gods felt the shift, as though the very bones of the earth had begun to loosen, and so the Anunnaki gathered, not as warriors, not as judges, not as tempests or flame, but as a council, a quiet assembly of ancient presence, deliberating beneath the vast, still sky. The earliest myths do not describe chaos. They describe calm consideration, a recognition that the structure of existence had reached a breaking point. Something new was needed, something the world had never seen, a being shaped not from celestial fire, but from earth itself, a being strong enough to carry burdens, yet gentle enough to coexist with divine order, a being who would walk the land, tend its fields, build its temples, and keep the rituals that held heaven and earth together. And so, in the quiet shadow of that ancient crisis, humanity was imagined. The tablets describe the moment with both solemnity and softness. A divine being was chosen, one whose life and essence would bind the heavens to the soil. Clay was gathered from the riverbanks. Sacred blood was mixed into it. The womb goddesses shaped the first forms. In slow, deliberate motions, 14 beings, 7 male, 7 female, emerged from their hands, eyes opening to a world already in motion. Humanity's purpose was clear from the beginning, to share the labor that had become too heavy for the Igigi alone. But this purpose did not diminish the gift they carried. Within each human form lived a spark of divine essence, a quiet shimmer of something older than creation itself. For a time, the arrangement worked beautifully. Humans tended the fields. They cared for the sacred places. They maintained the rituals that kept the world aligned. Their villages grew. Their voices filled the plains with laughter, stories, and the soft hum of life. But then, once again, the balance shifted. As humanity multiplied, their sound rose, first softly, then steadily, then overwhelmingly, like a tide that reached the edges of heaven. The noise of human life, the richness of their presence, their songs, their footsteps, their daily rhythm, all of it drifted upward, until Enlil himself could no longer rest. And once more, the Anunnaki gathered, not in anger, not in haste, but in contemplation. The world had become too loud, too crowded, too full of the unpredictable energy of human existence. The question before the divine council was not one of punishment, but of equilibrium. How should the world be restored? How could harmony return without unraveling everything that had been created? The answer came in the form of a flood, a cleansing, a great quieting, a return to the stillness that had existed before human voices filled the plains. The waters rose, cities dissolved, the earth washed clean. But even in this moment of vast destruction, another story moved quietly beneath. Enki, keeper of deep waters, friend of humanity, the god of wisdom and gentle intervention, chose compassion over silence. He whispered warnings through dreams and symbols. He guided Atrahasis, and later Utnapishtim, to build a vessel large enough to hold life itself. And so, while the world reset, a small pocket of hope floated above the waves. When the waters receded, humanity emerged again, quieter, humbler, aware of the fragile line between harmony and chaos. But the story of the Anunnaki does not end with creation and flood. It reaches deeper into the unseen places of existence. Beneath the earth, in a realm of dust and shadow, Ereshkigal ruled a silent kingdom, not of punishment, not of torment, but of stillness. Every soul, great or small, returned eventually to this dim, unhurried world. Offerings from the living could bring comfort, but not escape. This vision of the afterlife reflected the realism of Mesopotamian life, a world of harsh rains, harsh droughts, and the understanding that death was not a story of judgment, but of return. And throughout these realms, sky, earth, and underworld, the Anunnaki moved quietly, maintaining the architecture of destiny with steady, unseen hands. Their influence appears again in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving epic on Earth, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu entered the cedar forest and confronted Humbaba. They were not facing a monster, but a guardian, a boundary, a living reminder that some spaces were not meant to be touched. When the boundary was broken, the balance shifted, and the Anunnaki responded with the same calm inevitability that shaped creation and flood. A life had to restore the equilibrium, and that life was Enkidu's. The death of the bull of heaven repeated the pattern. Another rupture, another necessary correction. These stories did not frighten the people of Mesopotamia. They guided them. They taught them that every action carries weight, every disruption carries consequence, every imbalance requires restoration. Order, not chaos, was the foundation of their world. Later civilizations, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, carried the same belief forward. Kingship descended from heaven, not as conquest, but as responsibility. Rituals were performed, not to please capricious gods, but to maintain alignment with cosmic rhythm. Temples were built, not for spectacle, but to mirror the universe. In architecture of brick and shadow, through each era, the Anunnaki remained, the quiet presence behind the world's structure, not thunder, not fire, not commands shouted across the sky, but order, balance, pattern, the steady heartbeat of existence itself. And now, thousands of years later, their story returns to us softly, not as doctrine, not as mystery, but as a gentle echo of humanity's earliest attempt. To understand life, the Anunnaki do not demand belief. They invite reflection. They ask us to listen, the way the ancients listened, to rivers, to stars, to the quiet spaces where meaning gathers slowly, like dust settling in temple light. And as the last edges of this chapter softly fade into the dark, you begin to understand what the Sumerians felt so long ago, that the world is held together not by force, but by rhythm, a rhythm older than memory, older than clay, older than the first breath of humanity, a rhythm the ancients believed was kept by the Anunnaki. And now, as the story drifts onward, you feel the quiet invitation to follow. And as you follow that invitation, soft as breath, light as dust drifting through a sunbeam, the story begins to open in new directions, as if the ancient world is unfolding itself, layer by layer, revealing what has been waiting quietly beneath the surface of time. Because after the flood, after the reshaping of the world, after humanity stepped once more onto soil washed clean, something subtle changed. People became quieter, not in their daily work, not in their laughter, not in the gathering of families at dusk, but in the way they looked at the sky. They began to see the heavens, not as a realm of unreachable beings, but as a vast map etched with the signatures of the Anunnaki themselves. Night after night, priests watched the stars rise. In slow, deliberate procession, they recorded each movement, with strokes pressed gently into clay, and as they did, they whispered a truth, passed down through generations, that the sky was not chaos and not accident, but an ordered tapestry, woven by hands older than memory. The people believed that the stars were tools of the divine council, markers of seasons, omens of kingship, signals of balance or imbalance within the great architecture of the world. And because of this, each observation carried weight. A priest watching Venus rise was not just looking at a planet, he was reading the pulse of the cosmos. A scribe noting the eclipse of the moon was not documenting an event, he was witnessing a whisper of the Anunnaki, moving across the night, the quiet order that governed creation, that governed flood, that governed the underworld, was believed to govern the stars as well. And this belief brought a deep calm to the ancient world, because if the heavens moved with such precision, then perhaps the world beneath them could too. Perhaps the chaos of life was not chaos at all, but a cycle too vast for human eyes to see. Perhaps even suffering was part of a rhythm that would someday resolve itself into something balanced, something whole. In this way, the influence of the Anunnaki settled into every part of life, into the planting of fields, into the carving of laws, into the building of temples, whose stairways rose, like softened mountains, under the glow of dawn. Each temple, each altar, each courtyard, each offering was a reminder of the ancient belief that harmony could be maintained through deliberate action. A ritual was never rushed, a prayer was never shouted. Everything moved with the same slow patience as the myths that shaped the world. And across centuries, as cities rose and fell, the rhythm continued. In the marketplaces of Uruk, merchants weighing barley believed the scales echoed the cosmic balance maintained by the Anunnaki. In the schools of Nippur, young scribes learning the curve of each cuneiform line understood that writing was more than communication. It was participation in an ancient tradition that kept knowledge alive. Even the rulers, those who built palaces, those who commanded armies, walked with an understanding that their power was borrowed, not owned, that their authority depended on alignment with the laws set in the earliest days of the world. And when a king failed to uphold that harmony, when he neglected the temples, ignored the rituals, or caused suffering without cause, the people believed. The Anunnaki withdrew their support. Drought followed, flood followed, war followed, not as punishment, but as consequence, a natural rebalancing of a world designed to be steady. Even today, when we walk among ruins that have endured thousands of years, the air feels different, still, heavy, ancient, as if the memory of that old balance still lingers in the dust. If you stand in the remains of a ziggurat at dusk, you might feel it, the quiet certainty that life once moved to a slower rhythm, a rhythm of sunrise and harvest, of moon and tide, of the steady breath of civilizations that built their lives around the idea of cosmic alignment. And as we listen to these stories now, with soft lights, with quiet minds, with the modern world fading just beyond the edge of thought, we begin to feel what the ancients felt. We begin to understand why they told these stories. In courtyards at night, why they whispered them to restless children, why they recited them during times of fear or uncertainty. Because these myths, the creation, the flood, the underworld, the councils of the gods, were not told to frighten. They were told to steady the heart, to remind people that they belonged to something vast, something ordered, something ancient and enduring. And thousands of years later, the calm remains. It moves through the story like a slow river. It settles into the breath. It softens the thoughts that rise and drift like smoke. And as the chapter draws toward its gentle close, you feel the same quiet truth that guided the earliest listeners, that beneath the noise of life there is order, that beneath fear there is pattern, that beneath chaos there is rhythm, and that rhythm, soft, slow, eternal, is what the ancient world believed the Anunnaki were entrusted to keep. So now, as you prepare to move into the next chapter of their story, let that rhythm linger inside you, a rhythm as old as the first dawn, a rhythm carried across centuries by hands that shaped the earliest world, a rhythm that continues even now, quiet but unbroken, the rhythm of the Anunnaki. They did not rule the heavens like distant kings, and they did not drift through the skies as untouchable spirits. In the oldest cities of Mesopotamia, the presence of the Anunnaki was not imagined above the world, but within it. To walk through a Sumerian city was, in their eyes, to walk through a place shaped by divine hands. Every brick, every gate, every courtyard, every quiet alley filled with evening dust was part of a pattern that the ancients believed had been whispered to them from a time before memory. The cities themselves seemed to breathe. Eridu, Uruk, Larsa, Nippur. Their names drift through the centuries like soft echoes, still carrying the same quiet reverence the people once felt, as they walked beneath the shadows of painted temples. It was said that these temples were more than places of worship. They were bridges, anchors that held the world steady, places where divine order touched the dust of the earth. At dawn, when the desert was still cool and the sky hung pale over the rooftops, priests would climb the steps of the ziggurats with slow, measured footsteps. The world below was silent, waiting for the rituals that marked the beginning of each day. The offerings were small, the movements simple, the prayers whispered in voices that barely broke the morning calm. They believed that if these rituals stopped, the rhythm of life itself would falter. And so they continued, day after day, year after year, slowly, patiently, like breath moving through a sleeping world. In these cities, the presence of the Anunnaki was not loud or fearful. It was gentle, woven into the way the canals carried the river water, into the way harvests rose and fell, into the way the stars arranged themselves in the night sky. To the people living there, the world did not feel empty. It felt watched, not with harsh judgment, but with an ancient steadiness that kept the seasons turning and the rivers flowing. Nippur, the sacred center of the land, was believed to be the heart of this steady order. Here the great temple of Enlil stood on foundations older than kings, older than the first stories, older than the memory of the people who worshipped there. They believed that kingship descended through this place, not as a reward, but as a responsibility carried gently from heaven to earth. A king was not a conqueror. He was a caretaker, a figure meant to preserve balance, to protect the fragile alignment between humanity and the divine. And in this quiet vision of rulership, the Anunnaki were always present, steady and watchful behind the scenes, like pillars holding up the invisible structure of the world. The temples themselves were small worlds, each one a reflection of a greater cosmic design. Inside them, scribes worked by dim lamplight, pressing soft clay into tablets, with slow, deliberate strokes. Each mark carried meaning. Each symbol was a record of something that mattered, a measure of grain, a record of stars, a promise made, a boundary set. Nothing written was ever rushed. Nothing was without purpose. Outside the temple walls, life moved with the same gentle patience. Merchants walked through markets carrying baskets of dates and barley. Children gathered near wells, playing in the shade cast by towering stone walls. Farmers returned from the fields, their footsteps slow from the long day beneath the sun. Everything felt steady, as though the entire city breathed to the same ancient rhythm. And overseeing it all were the temples, rising slowly, like great stairways carved into the horizon. The ziggurats were not meant to impress with height alone. They were built to imitate the mountains, sacred places where the earth touched the sky. But Mesopotamia had no mountains of its own, so the people made them, patiently, carefully, brick by brick, until they stood tall enough to remind the world that heaven and earth were never entirely separate. At night, the cities grew quiet. Oil lamps flickered. Wind moved softly between the empty streets. The temples stood still and silent beneath the stars, their shadows stretching long across the sleeping ground. It was in this silence that the people felt the presence of the Anunnaki most strongly, in the calm that settled over the courtyards, in the steady glow of the moon on the river, in the soft rustle of reeds along the waterbanks. Nothing supernatural was expected. No voices were demanded. The divine existed in the order of things, in the calm repetition of each day, in the peaceful cycle that made the cities feel safe and whole. And as centuries passed, the cities grew and changed. Some rose to greatness, some fell to dust, but the rhythm remained, carried quietly through the generations. A mother teaching her child when to plant seeds, a scribe learning the stars from an older teacher, a king performing a ceremony to renew the land's blessing, a worker leaving bread at the temple steps in gratitude. Small actions, gentle actions, woven together until they formed the quiet fabric of life. The deeper the people lived within this rhythm, the more they felt that everything Every stone, every field, every drop of water belonged to a pattern older than their own breath. The Anunnaki, in their minds, were not separate from the world. They were the hidden architecture behind its very shape. And so, even now, when all that remains of those cities are scattered foundations and weathered bricks softened by sand, the ancient calm still lingers in the silence around them. If you stood among those ruins today, in the quiet hour just before sunrise, you might feel it. That same steady presence, that same gentle order, that same whisper of a world, once held together by faith in the unseen rhythm behind all things. A rhythm that guided their cities, guided their kings, guided their temples, guided their lives. A rhythm that moved slowly, softly, and endlessly, just like the ancient story that still drifts through the night. And if you linger long enough in that imagined dawn, you might sense the world of the ancients settling around you, layer by layer, like soft dust drifting down through time. For the cities they built, the lives they lived, and the quiet faith they carried were all part of a tapestry so gentle, so patient, that it moved almost like a dream. In those early days, when the world was still young and the rivers still carved their fresh paths into the earth, the people believed that every part of their day, from the moment they woke to the moment they returned to rest, was held together by an unseen harmony. They walked through their cities not as rulers of nature, but as participants in its rhythm. When the sun rose over the plains, they felt the warmth as a blessing. When the wind brushed through the reeds by the riverbanks, they felt it as a whisper of the divine. When shadows stretched long across the fields at dusk, they felt them settle like a soft reminder that the world was never entirely theirs to command. They belonged to the land, as much as the land belonged to them. And in this delicate balance, the Anunnaki were ever present, not in form, not in sound, but in the quiet order that shaped each moment. The people believed that the world worked, because the gods had set it into motion with purpose. And so they lived with purpose too, always attentive, always gentle with their surroundings, always mindful that they were part of something older and larger than any single lifetime. As seasons drifted across the years, the cities grew into living organisms of their own. The canals that wound through them were like veins, bringing nourishment to the fields and orchards. The walls enclosed families, traditions, and stories that accumulated slowly, the way clay gathers layer after layer in the riverbed. Every structure was built with intention, every street aligned with something sacred. Nothing was careless. Nothing was added thoughtlessly. The Anunnaki were believed to have given the first designs, the ways temples should face the rising sun, the ways granaries should store the harvest, the ways marketplaces should open to the flow of people and goods. And because these designs came from the divine, they were repeated for centuries without question, not from fear, but from trust. Trust that the old ways were steady ways, that the old rhythms were safe rhythms. Even the simplest actions carried quiet meaning. When a potter shaped clay upon a wheel, he believed he was mirroring the act of creation itself, shaping something out of earth, forming it with patience, giving it purpose. When a shepherd guided his flock across the plains, he believed the gods walked the same paths long before, seeing the same horizon, feeling the same wind. When a family lit a lamp at night, its glow against the mud-brick walls felt like a small echo of the stars above, a reflection of heaven's light, brought gently down to earth. The belief that the Anunnaki lived within the city, within the daily rituals, within the quiet patterns of existence, made every moment feel woven into something sacred. And yet, for all the grandeur of the temples and the depth of the myths, the people lived simple lives, lives filled with work, with rest, with laughter, with shared meals, with stories told beneath the stars. At night, families gathered in open courtyards, seated on low stools made of woven reeds. The air cooled, and the distant calls of night birds drifted over the rooftops. In the soft glow of the lamps, elders recited tales passed through generations, tales of creation, tales of kings and heroes, tales of floods and new beginnings. Children listened with heavy eyes, their breaths slowing, their minds drifting into the half-world between waking and dreaming. And as the stories flowed, the boundaries between myth and reality seemed to blur into one. The Anunnaki were not distant figures in these moments. They felt close, almost like quiet guardians, watching gently over the sleepers. Even as time carried the world forward, and new generations replaced the old, this sense of closeness remained. The farmers continued to plant under the guidance of ancient calendars. The scribes continued to write in the shadow of ancient walls. The kings continued to rule in the ways set down long before them. The priests continued to perform rituals in the same slow, deliberate manner that their teachers and their teachers' teachers had followed. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Everything moved with the soft weight of centuries. And when storms came, sometimes fierce, sometimes sudden, the people understood them not as signs of wrath, but as reminders of the world's natural balance. Rain would fall hard upon the land, and the rivers would swell in their beds. But the cities were ready. Their canals opened like welcoming arms, drawing the waters along familiar channels, until calm returned. Life always returned to stillness. Stillness was the foundation of their world. Even in times of upheaval, when neighbouring kingdoms clashed, or when trade routes shifted, or when drought lingered longer than expected, the people returned to the practices that anchored them. The rituals, the stories, the patterns given by the Anunnaki in the earliest days of creation. It was this steadiness that allowed the cities to survive for thousands of years. Not strength alone, not wealth alone, but rhythm, soft, persistent, ancient as the soil beneath their feet. Generations rose, lived, and faded. Walls crumbled, streets shifted, languages evolved, kings were crowned, and later forgotten. But the deep feeling that the world was guided by an unseen order never disappeared. It carried people through joy and sorrow, through harvest and drought, through peace and conflict. Always steady, always present, always whispering, and even today, long after the last ziggurat lost its painted surface, long after the last priest finished his final ritual, long after the desert winds reclaimed the open courtyards, that whisper still lingers. You can feel it in the still air above the ruins, in the cracked stones warmed by the sun, in the faint outlines of ancient streets that once guided countless footsteps. It is a quiet reminder that human life, no matter how small or fragile, was once lived with a profound sense of belonging to a world where the divine was not distant, but woven into the dust, the breath, the heartbeat of everyday existence. And as you rest now, slowly drifting with the rhythm of this ancient memory, you might feel yourself held in the same gentle calm that once settled over the early cities of the world, a calm shaped not by noise or spectacle, but by steady order, soft presence, and the tender belief that all of life moves according to a quiet, timeless design, a design the Anunnaki were believed to keep, with hands unseen, with voices unheard, and with a patience as endless as the night sky above. They did not rise suddenly into power, and they did not fall in a single moment. In Mesopotamia, the influence of the Anunnaki moved the way great rivers move, slowly, quietly, reshaping the land over centuries. By the time later kingdoms rose from the southern plains, the world the Sumerians built had already begun to shift. But even as cultures changed, the quiet framework the Anunnaki were believed to have set continued to guide kings, temples, and entire civilizations. It happened softly, so softly that no generation ever realized how much the world was changing beneath their feet. As the centuries drifted forward, the ancient cities grew more crowded. Their walls stretched outward, their temples rose higher, their marketplaces filled with new voices, new dialects, new customs, and yet, beneath all these changes, the same gentle belief remained, that somewhere, beyond the noise of daily life, a deeper order still held the world together. The Sumerians had been the first to give this order a shape, but the Akkadians, who came after them, carried the same quiet reverence into their own age. When Sargon rose to power, not by slow inheritance but by sudden unification. Scribes wrote that his kingship did not originate from his armies or his victories. They wrote that it descended from heaven, a soft reminder that authority was never merely human. Behind every throne, they believed, stood the steady presence of the Anunnaki, as silent and constant as the stars. Across the land, new cities began to echo the old ones. New tablets were pressed with symbols familiar and ancient. New rituals were performed in temples that echoed the same quiet rhythm. Sumerian priests had followed long before. Nothing was rushed. Even change itself seemed to move at the pace of patient breath. In the cool mornings, the sound of scribes preparing their clay could be heard in palace courtyards. A gentle patting, a soft pressing, the faint scratch of a stylus carving words into wet earth. They recorded omens, markets, treaties, poems, hymns, but always with a calm certainty that the unseen structure of the world remained intact, and when night returned, lamps flickered in long corridors of palaces and temples, casting warm glows on walls painted with images of gods and kings. The people believed that the Anunnaki moved through these spaces, not as figures of fear, but as a quiet assurance that each day would rise connected to the next. When the Akkadian kingdom eventually softened and gave way to Babylon, the transition was not a collapse, but a long exhale, a slow shift from one rhythm to another. In Babylon, the world was reorganized again, but always gently, as if shaped by hands that remembered the patterns of older ages. The temples grew larger, the cities expanded, and in the heart of Babylon, a new order of the heavens began to take shape. Astronomers stood on rooftops throughout the night, watching the slow rising of Venus, the careful wandering of Mars, the steady glow of Jupiter. They believed that these movements were not random, but the language of the divine, and as they observed the sky, they softly repeated the same idea the Sumerians had whispered centuries earlier. The stars were placed by the Anunnaki, each one carrying a purpose, each one marking the pattern of seasons, kingship, destiny, and time. This belief flowed gently through the land, passed from teacher to student, scribe to apprentice, priest to initiate. Nothing loud, nothing forced, always steady. In those same years, the great ziggurat of Babylon rose toward the sky, a layered mountain of brick, built slowly, carefully, in measured stages that echoed the gentle steps of ancient worship. Workers carried baskets of clay on their shoulders. In slow, rhythmic movements, architects traced lines and proportions that they believed matched the order of heavens. Priests blessed each layer before the next was placed, and when it was finished, the city believed they had created a bridge between the world of mortals and the quiet realm of the divine. The belief was never that the gods would descend in brilliance or spectacle. Instead, people felt that the presence of the Anunnaki lay in the alignment itself, in the way the structure echoed the shape of the sky, the way its terraces caught the sunrise, the way its shadow lengthened slowly across the city each evening. Time continued its gentle movement, and Babylon eventually gave way to the rising strength of Assyria. But once again, the change was not immediate. It moved softly, almost imperceptibly, as though carried by a long wind that took decades to cross the land. Assyrian kings carved their victories into stone, but always with the same quiet acknowledgement that their triumphs were guided by the divine counsel. Inscriptions describe army marching across distant territories, but they also describe rituals of renewal, offerings given at dawn, lamps lit at dusk, songs whispered to keep the balance of the world in place. Even the warriors of Assyria, fierce and disciplined, believed that strength was only part of the equation. Behind every victory was the steady rhythm that had guided the land since the earliest days of Sumer. Through every shift, through every change in language, culture, or power, one thing remained unchanged. The Anunnaki were still the quiet architecture behind the world. They were not thunder. They were not flame. They were not commands shouted across the heavens. They were the slow turning of time, the steady movement of the stars, the quiet bond between earth and sky. And as the centuries continued to unfold, the people of Mesopotamia still felt their presence, in small, gentle moments, in the rising of the river after a long dry season, in the soft glow of lamps lit before sleep, in the precise arrangement of tablets stored in temple archives, in the measured footsteps of priests walking the same paths. Their ancestors had walked 1,000 years before. By then, the ancient cities had changed shape many times. Walls had been rebuilt. Temples had been restored. Kings had come and gone like passing seasons. But the rhythm remained. Soft, steady, enduring. And even now, when all that's left are scattered stones, crumbled carvings, and faint outlines of streets that once carried the footsteps of millions, the quiet pattern they believed in still seems to hover over the land, a soft reminder that long ago, in a world guided by ritual and order, the Anunnaki were not just gods, they were the calm beneath everything, the slow breath of the ancient world, the steady balance that held time together, the quiet presence that moved gently through cities, through temples, through generations, and through every moment of the Mesopotamian night. And if you listen closely to that imagined night, to the wind brushing over forgotten courtyards, to the faint settling of dust along ancient stone, you may begin to sense something deeper, something the people of those cities once felt, each time they lifted their eyes to the quiet sky. For the presence of the Anunnaki, as they believed, was never loud or overwhelming. It was something softer, something that lived between moments, in the spaces where silence gathers, like a thin veil draped over the world. Even as the great empires shifted, as Babylon flourished and fell, as Assyria rose and thundered across distant lands, as rulers carved their triumphs in stone only for time to soften them, the quiet thread remained, a thread that linked every temple, every prayer, every dawn ritual, every evening offering, back to the unseen order the ancients believed held the world together. In the centuries after the Assyrians, the land continued to change its shape. New powers arrived from beyond the horizon. New languages filled the marketplaces. New customs mixed with the old, but even then, the rhythm did not vanish. It simply settled deeper into the landscape, like water sinking slowly into fertile soil. In those later days, when scholars from distant kingdoms came to study the old cities, they found tablet fragments scattered like fallen leaves. Some were broken, some were worn smooth at the edges, some held only half a sentence, half an omen, half a prayer. Yet even in these fragments, they sensed the same gentleness, the same certainty, that life once moved to a pattern as steady as the tide. Among these fragments were records of festivals, quiet gatherings that blended music, offerings, and simple joy into a single, graceful moment of connection between earth and sky. There were songs for planting seasons, songs for harvest, songs for the renewal of kingship, songs for the rising of stars, that appeared only once every many years. These celebrations were not loud revelries, but soft acknowledgements of the flow of time. Families prepared small offerings, dates, barley, bowls of milk, and placed them gently before temple gates, as a gesture of gratitude for the orderly world they believed the Anunnaki preserved. And in the long stillness after the ceremonies ended, torches flickered softly along the temple walls, casting slow-moving shadows that swayed like memories. Often, priests sat quietly outside the sanctuaries, listening to the night, feeling the cool desert breeze pass over them, as though it carried whispers of ages long past. These priests were not figures of power. They were caretakers, keepers of a tradition that had flowed unbroken through thousands of years. They trained young scribes to read the stars and interpret their gentle movements as signs of the deeper order. They taught the next generation how to press tablets with a steady hand, how to record grain measurements in perfect alignment, how to read omens without fear or haste. Because in their world, knowledge was not a burden. It was a way to become part of the pattern. And so the teachings passed on, slowly, patiently, like a quiet stream flowing beneath the surface of life. Even when foreign empires arrived, Persians with their disciplined order, Greeks with their searching philosophies, the old temples still stood. Some fell into disrepair, some remained active, some were transformed into new kinds of sacred spaces, but the sense of rhythm persisted, woven subtly into the daily routines of people who ploughed the same soil and followed the same rising of the moon that their ancestors had known for centuries. In remote villages of the later ages, families still watched the stars and whispered old names, now softened by time, not out of fear, but out of familiarity, as though those ancient presences were part of the land itself. Farmers would pause at dusk, resting their hands on wooden ploughs, watching the last light fade into the riverbeds, and in that moment of stillness, they felt the same quiet connection their ancestors had felt long ago. Travellers walking along dusty roads carried tales of old temples they had seen, ruins softened by sand, pillars half buried, clay tablets crumbling in the dry heat. Yet even in decay, those ruins radiated a strange peace, because they were not just remnants of old buildings, they were reminders of a worldview in which everything belonged somewhere and nothing existed alone. In the centuries that followed, when the desert winds grew stronger and the rivers shifted their banks, many ancient cities disappeared beneath layers of earth. Some were forgotten entirely, others lived on in stories whispered by shepherds, tending their flocks in the moonlit fields. But even forgotten cities carry memory in their stones, and when archaeologists, thousands of years later, brushed dust from buried foundations, they found not chaos, but order, not randomness, but patterns. Walls aligned with celestial points, courtyards designed with perfect symmetry, canals positioned in harmony with seasonal floods. The calm logic the ancients believed came from the Anunnaki was still present in the ruins, quiet, patient, undisturbed by time. In modern days, travellers walk among these remains, without fully realizing that they are stepping through the memory of a world built upon tranquility. They do not know why the silence feels heavier there, why the air feels older, why the ground echoes faintly, with an unnameable stillness. But the old world knew, the Sumerians knew, the Akkadians knew, the Babylonians knew, the Assyrians knew. They believed that behind every event, every sunrise, every harvest, every shift of power, every fall of a kingdom, there was always a quiet pattern guiding the world forward. Not pushing, not forcing, only guiding. Softly, gently, patiently, and though the names have faded and the temples have crumbled, that belief in gentle structure remains woven into the dust itself. So if you stand among those ruins, as dawn begins to rise and the light stretches softly across the stones, if you breathe slowly and listen deeply, you may feel what the ancients felt, a sense that the world is held together by something calm, something steady, something older than memory and softer than sleep, a presence that the people once called the Anunnaki, a quiet heartbeat beneath creation, a rhythm still drifting through the Mesopotamian morning. They did not disappear when the old temples became dust. They did not vanish when new kings carved their names over ancient walls, and they did not fade when foreign languages filled the streets of Babylon. The Anunnaki simply changed shape, and as the world around them drifted into new eras, their presence moved quietly, like a breath carried from one generation to the next, soft enough to go unnoticed, steady enough to never truly leave. For when the old Sumerian cities grew silent, their stories did not end. They simply began a new chapter. As century passed, the world shifted slowly, like sand carried across an endless desert, like a river changing its banks grain by grain. New kingdoms rose, new priests performed new rituals, new languages appeared in markets and palaces, but the quiet memory of the Anunnaki continued to flow beneath everything, like an undercurrent moving just below the surface of time. When Alexander's armies reached Mesopotamia, they found ruins older than anything their world had imagined. Temples layered upon temples, libraries filled with symbols no Greek scholar could yet read, and the remains of cities that seemed to exhale a kind of ancient calm. The Greeks had their own gods, their own myths, their own way of imagining the universe. Yet they sensed immediately that the stories preserved in this land belonged to an age far deeper than their own. And so, instead of erasing them, they listened. They watched the ziggurats at sunset, their shadows long upon the plain. They studied the tablets that survived in palace storerooms. They sat with Babylonian scholars who traced the slow wandering of planets with a precision the Greeks had never seen. In the quiet of this exchange, something gentle happened. The world of the Anunnaki began to merge with the world of Greece, not through conquest, but through curiosity. Scholars came to believe that the wisdom of the East, its star charts, its law codes, its creation stories, held keys to understanding the mysteries of existence. And so echoes of the Anunnaki began to weave themselves into Greek thought. Old Mesopotamian gods were compared to Olympians. Ancient stories were retold in new voices. Ideas that once belonged only to Sumerian priests were carried westward into philosophy, into astronomy, into the quiet halls where scholars wrote by lamplight. The transformation was gentle, like a ripple travelling across water. When the Greeks gave way to new empires, the memory did not stop. The Persian world, vast and solemn, absorbed the last priests of Babylon. These priests brought with them star tables, rituals, and fragments of stories so old, their origins were already fading into myth. In the cities of Persia, astronomers studied the sky using methods first whispered in Sumerian temples. They measured eclipses with numbers taught in Nippur. They divided the heavens according to patterns preserved on clay thousands of years old. Even if the names of the Anunnaki were no longer spoken aloud, their quiet architecture, the way they had shaped time, shaped ritual, shaped the connection between heaven and earth, continued like a breath that never fully ended. And then came another turning of the ages. People from distant lands, carried into Babylon by conquest and exile, walked the same streets where Sumerian kings once prayed. They listened to the priests recite creation stories. In echoes of the oldest language ever written, they heard of a great flood, of a council of gods, of a garden watered by 4 rivers. These stories settled into their memory, the way snow settles on mountains, quietly, gently, steadily, until they became part of their own traditions. Generations later, these echoes resurfaced in new scriptures, new philosophies, new visions of the cosmos. No one spoke the name Anunnaki anymore, but the structure remained. A divine council, a cosmic order, a universe shaped not by chaos, but by ancient deliberation. And as time carried the world even further, into the empires of Rome, into the rise of Arabia, into the golden age of Islamic scholars, the memory continued its silent drift. In Baghdad, in the libraries of the Abbasid world, scholars translated Greek texts. Texts that had quietly absorbed fragments of Babylon, which had quietly absorbed fragments of Sumer. And in this long chain of inheritance, the old ideas lived on, not as gods, but as knowledge, the careful mapping of stars, the division of time, the belief that the cosmos follows an orderly pattern, the idea that destiny is woven into the structure of the universe. These were the quiet legacies of the Anunnaki, still breathing beneath new names, new teachers, new ages. Even the storytellers who wandered through markets, sharing tales under starlit skies, still carried faint reflections of the old world. Stories of beings who shaped the earth, stories of councils in heaven, stories of great floods, and the fragile balance between humans and the divine. And though the names had changed, the rhythm was the same, soft, steady, ancient. By the time archaeologists uncovered the ruins, buried beneath thousands of years of sand, the world had long forgotten the old stories. But the stones had not, the tablets had not. The foundations of temples, the orientation of stairways, the alignment of courtyards, they had preserved the memory with a patience far beyond human life. And when the cuneiform tablets were finally read again, in the quiet rooms of modern scholars, the voices that had been silent for millennia returned softly, not in thunder, not in revelation, but in gentle whispers of ancient lore, ancient stories, ancient order. The Anunnaki had never truly left. They had simply transformed, from gods into symbols, from symbols into ideas, from ideas into the invisible architecture behind how civilizations understand the universe. And even now, as you rest, as you drift through this gentle story, their presence is still there, in the calm repetition of the stars, in the quiet order of your own breathing, in the soft memory of a world that once believed. The universe was held together by steady, unseen hands, hands they once called the Anunnaki. They had become more than names on clay, more than figures in myths, more than memories carried through languages long dissolved into dust. By the time the modern world opened their tablets again, the Anunnaki had lived many lifetimes, not as beings of flesh or spirit, but as ideas moving quietly through the corridors of human thought. So much of their journey had depended on silence, soft transmission, unseen inheritance, and yet, when their words resurfaced, it was as if a door had opened, a door no one knew existed, leading back into a world both familiar and impossibly distant. For the tablets did not simply record rituals or laws, they carried the breath of a civilization that had once looked at the universe and imagined it as a great woven pattern, threads of destiny and time, held together by steady, unseen hands. When these tablets were first deciphered, in dim rooms filled with dust and lamplight, scholars paused, not because they expected to find answers, but because they realized they had stepped into a conversation that began 5,000 years ago. And as more lines of cuneiform were translated, the soft architecture of the ancient world took shape again, piece by piece, word by word, breath by breath. They learned that the people of Sumer had constructed their cities as reflections of the cosmos, temples aligned with stars, gateways aligned with seasons, courtyards aligned with the quiet turning of the moon. They learned that people believed time itself flowed from the heavens, carried into the world by the Anunnaki, not as commandments, but as rhythm. This rhythm found its way into the practices of later civilizations, into calendars carved in Greece, into astronomical texts of Persia, into the libraries of Babylon, and even into the meditations of scholars who wrote in Arabic centuries later. All of them, without fully realizing it, continued a quiet tradition begun in the earliest temples of the world. And as archaeologists brushed the sand off broken stairways and shattered tablets, something else emerged, a realization that the ancient people did not imagine their gods as far away. The presence of the Anunnaki had always been close, woven into daily life, like threads in a garment. They were believed to move with the rivers, to guide the harvest, to watch over the quiet steps of kings and workers alike. This closeness, this intimacy, shaped how the myths travelled through time, because even when their names were forgotten, the feeling remained, a sense that somewhere, beneath all change and all uncertainty, there is an order older than memory, a steadiness that does not vanish, a presence that does not need to be seen, to be felt. And so the Anunnaki continued to live, not in temples, not in rituals, but in the quiet human instinct to search for meaning in the pattern of things, in the way a shepherd watches the sky, in the way a mother teaches her child to honor the passing of seasons, in the way a poet writes about the relationship between heaven and earth, in the way scholars trace the slow movement of planets across endless years. These simple acts, these soft continuations, were how the memory survived. And then, in the modern age, something unexpected happened. As explorers uncovered more ruins, as linguists deciphered more tablets, as museums filled with fragments of ancient worlds, the story of the Anunnaki began to drift beyond academia. People who had never seen a clay tablet felt something awaken when they heard the old stories, a quiet curiosity, an instinctive pull toward a time when the universe seemed connected, orderly, alive with intention. The stories were gentle, their imagery soft, their rhythm slow, a perfect echo for a world where many long for calm, clarity, and meaning. And so the Anunnaki returned, not as gods of power, but as voices of reflection, a reminder of how early humanity made sense of existence. Without noise, without chaos, without rushing, their myths became something to fall asleep to, not because they were dull, but because they were steady, measured, comforting. They spoke of order that outlasts empires, of patterns that continue even when names are forgotten, of the ancient idea that the universe is held together, not by violence, but by balance, balance that breathes, softly, slowly, endlessly. And perhaps that is why, when people hear their stories today, they feel something settle inside them, like dust settling over ruins. When the wind grows quiet, for the journey of the Anunnaki is not only the journey of ancient gods, but the journey of human thought itself. It is the journey from chaos to order, from fear to understanding, from searching to accepting, that the world moves, according to rhythms older than any one of us. Rhythms we do not control, but can feel. Rhythms that guided the first civilizations. Rhythms that guided the rise and fall of empires. Rhythms that still guide the turning of planets and the quiet cycle of night into day. They have become the soft echo of a world that once believed in calm connection between heaven and earth. And if you listen long enough, in the quiet of night, in the stillness between breaths, in the gentle drift towards sleep, you might hear it too, a faint whisper carried across time, not loud, not demanding, just steady, the same whisper the ancients heard when they looked at the stars and felt the presence of something older, vaster, and endlessly patient, something they called the Anunnaki. They did not return with thunder, and they did not come back in the way old myths imagined, descending from the sky, walking among cities, restoring temples long lost to time. Instead, the return of the Anunnaki was something far quieter, almost too soft to notice at first. Their second life began, not in ancient rituals, not in the deserts where their temples once stood, but in libraries, in quiet study rooms, in the stillness of late-night reading, where scholars worked beneath dim lanterns, trying to understand symbols pressed into clay 5,000 years before they were born. It was in these hushed spaces that the Anunnaki awakened again, not as gods, but as memory. When the first tablets were deciphered, the world did not react with shock. There were no proclamations, no celebrations, no sudden revelations. There was only stillness, a quiet realization that humanity had opened a window into a world older than any scripture, older than any empire, older even than the concept of documented history. And through that window, the soft outlines of the Anunnaki appeared once more, not clearly, not fully, just shadows of an ancient idea, moving slowly through time. As translations continued, the myths that had lived in silence for 40 centuries began to breathe again. Creation stories, temple hymns, star records, fragments of royal inscriptions, whispers of old cosmologies, all of them gently resurfaced, like long-buried seeds sprouting after rain. And in each fragment there was the soft presence of the Anunnaki, their roles, their rhythms, their quiet order, their steady influence over the ancient imagination. People of the modern age, who lived in a world of machines and screens, found themselves drawn to these slow, ancient stories. Stories built not on spectacle, but on balance, not on fear, but on understanding, not on miracles, but on an ordered cosmos, where everything had a place. And slowly, something unexpected happened, not loud, not sudden, just a gentle stirring. People began to feel a strange calm in the old stories, not because the Anunnaki were powerful, but because the world they represented moved at a different pace, slower, wiser, more rooted in the rhythm of seasons, and the quiet assurance that life unfolds, not through random chaos, but through patterns ancient and enduring. The more the tablets were studied, the more scholars realized the myths were less about gods and more about the structure of existence. And for many listeners today, that structure feels comforting, like a soft blanket, woven from the oldest threads of the human story. It feels steady, predictable, calm. In a modern world full of noise and constant motion, the ancient idea of cosmic order has a soothing effect, drawing people inward, slowing their thoughts, quieting the restless parts of the mind. And so the Anunnaki returned, not as beings of power, but as bringers of stillness. They became companions, for quiet nights, for drifting thoughts, for the gentle descent into sleep. Their myths were retold, not to shock, or frighten, or astonish, but to soothe, the way ancient storytellers once soothed the wanderings of the heart, by reciting tales under starlit skies. As their presence grew again, in books, in documentaries, in peaceful narrations meant for rest, the Anunnaki began to take on a new form, no longer fierce, no longer mysterious, no longer distant. Instead, they became symbols, soft reminders that humanity has always tried to understand the patterns hidden beneath existence. People found comfort in their stories because those stories were slow, measured, quiet, mirroring the gentle rhythms of breath and night and sleep. In this way, the Anunnaki found a new home in the modern world, not in temples, not in rituals, but in moments of stillness, in whispered stories, in calming voices, in quiet reflections that help the mind soften into rest. For the modern retelling of ancient myths does not require belief. It requires only listening the way the ancients listened to the river, to the wind moving through reeds, to the soft footsteps of priests walking beneath dawn light. The Anunnaki became a bridge, not between heaven and earth, but between the ancient world and the modern one, a reminder that countless generations gazed at the same stars. You see tonight, searching for meaning, exactly as you do now. Their myths, when spoken slowly, carry the same calming cadence that soothed ancient hearts. And as their stories spread online, across quiet corners of the digital world, where people seek gentle voices to fall asleep to, the Anunnaki entered a new chapter of existence, a chapter where they are not worshipped, not feared, not debated, but felt in the stillness, coming over the listener, as the story unfolds, felt in the slow, steady breath that follows the rise and fall of each word, felt in the way the mind relaxes, when reminded of a universe guided by patterns, not chaos, felt in the soft connection between ancient nights and modern ones. It is in these quiet moments that the Anunnaki return, not in form, but in feeling, as a hush over the mind, as a settling of the heart, as the warmth of an old story, softening the edges of consciousness until sleep begins to rise. And perhaps this is the gentlest truth. Their long journey reveals that myths survive, not because they demand belief, but because they offer comfort. Comfort in knowing that others long before us searched for meaning and found peace. In the idea of a quiet, ordered cosmos, comfort in imagining that even when civilizations crumble, the stories they leave behind can still guide us into rest, into reflection, into calm. And so, as you listen, as your breath slows, as the ancient rhythm settles inside you, the presence of the Anunnaki continues its soft return, not to reshape the world, but simply to remind you that beneath everything, beneath every age, beneath every change, there is a quiet thread connecting all human stories, a thread woven gently through time, a thread that still whispers in the peaceful dark, a thread you can follow into sleep. They did not return with signs in the sky, nor with footsteps shaking the earth. Their quiet return unfolded the way dawn does, softly, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until you realize the world has brightened, without knowing the exact moment it began. As more tablets were translated, more fragments assembled, more symbols understood, the Anunnaki continued drifting back into human awareness, not as deities demanding devotion, but as echoes of a calm, ancient worldview that modern people had forgotten they needed. Over time, the quiet fascination grew, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, spreading the way ripples expand from a single stone, dropped into still water. People began to read these stories late at night, while the world around them grew quiet. Some found that the slow rhythm of the myths matched the rhythm of their own breathing. Others felt something soften inside them, something long tensed, beginning to unwind. The myths were so old that their harsh edges had already been worn down by time itself. What remained was the calm center, the part that speaks not to the mind, but to the quiet place behind the mind, the place that listens, even when thoughts have drifted away. And in this quiet center, the presence of the Anunnaki settled softly again. Scholars noticed something curious as they continued studying the tablets. Even though the myths were thousands of years old, their tone felt surprisingly gentle, less like declarations, more like reflections. The ancient scribes did not describe chaos erupting from nothing, or gods battling endlessly for control. Instead, they described a world shaped slowly, purposely, almost meditatively. Creation, in these stories, felt more like tending a garden than forging a universe through violence. Order was not imposed through force, but through care. Balance was not a weapon, but a breath, and perhaps that is why modern listeners find comfort in the stories, because beneath their age lies a rhythm as familiar as the rise and fall of the chest, as sleep approaches, as more translations appeared, and as more people encountered this ancient calm. A new understanding slowly spread. People began to realize that the Anunnaki were less important as figures, and more important as symbols of something timeless. They represented the idea that life makes sense, even when we cannot see how, that the world follows cycles older than memory, that existence, beneath its noise, moves according to patterns that remain steady, even when everything else changes. In this way, the return of the Anunnaki was a return of perspective, a reminder that the world, for all its uncertainties, has always been held together by gentle, unseen forces. The ancients expressed that idea through gods. Modern people express it through science, through philosophy, through quiet reflection before sleep. But the feeling is the same. A feeling of being part of a story, much larger than one lifetime. The revival of interest in these ancient myths spread far beyond academic circles. Artists began to paint soft, dreamlike visions of the old world, towering ziggurats beneath violet skies, temple corridors washed in lamplight, desert winds moving across forgotten stones. Musicians created slow, soothing soundscapes, inspired by ancient instruments, lyre-like tones, distant drums, gentle chimes echoing like water in stone halls. Writers retold the myths, not as dramatic tales, but as reflections on balance and time. In all these new forms, the Anunnaki appeared again, not towering, not fearsome, but quiet, like guardians of a calm that reaches across ages. Even people who had never studied history found themselves moved by the serenity of those ancient worlds. Something in them recognized the peace woven into the old stories. Something in them recognized the steady rhythm. As their presence returned in this gentle way, a new phenomenon began to grow. People used the myths to fall asleep, not intentionally at first. It just happened. A late-night documentary with a calm narrator, a soft retelling of an old creation story, a quiet explanation of a forgotten temple. Listeners found their minds drifting, not away from the story, but deeper into it, as though the ancient rhythm was guiding them into rest. Online, a small group of listeners grew into thousands, then into millions. People began to seek out the soft cadence of ancient Mesopotamian myths as a way to quiet their thoughts. At the end of long days, the return of the Anunnaki was no longer a historical curiosity. It had become a source of peace. Their myths, once carved into clay tablets, for kings and priests, now soothe people in bedrooms lit only by the soft glow of screens. The Anunnaki, who once existed at the heart of the first human civilization, now existed at the edges of drifting consciousness, in the moments before dreams take over. In this new chapter, something beautiful emerged. Modern listeners began to feel connected to the ancient world in a way that transcended time. The sound of a calm voice telling an old story created a quiet bridge between today and a world long vanished. It did not matter that the temples were dust or that the languages had faded. What mattered was the feeling, a feeling that human beings have always sought meaning, that they have always watched the sky and wondered, that they have always tried to understand their place in the vastness of existence. The Anunnaki became part of that continuity, not as literal beings, but as echoes of the human desire for structure, purpose, and calm. As the myths spread through headphones and speakers, as they reached people falling asleep in distant cities and quiet villages, a new type of presence was born. The Anunnaki became companions for solitude, for silence, for the long moments between waking and dreaming. Their stories began to cradle the mind. In the same way, temple hymns once cradled the ancient world, with softness, with patience, with a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. In this way, without stepping from the clouds or rising from the earth, the Anunnaki returned, not as gods, but as comfort, not as rulers, but as rhythm, not as a force of fear, but as a guiding calm that reminds the heart of its place in the long, gentle story of the human spirit. So as you continue to listen, as your breath settles and your thoughts grow lighter, their quiet presence continues, moving through you the same way it moved through the ancient world, soft, slow, steady, timeless, a whisper from the first civilization carried into the quiet of your own night. They did not return through revelation. They returned through curiosity, through the slow turning of pages, through the gentle click of a late-night video, through the quiet hunger people feel when they search for something older than the noise of the modern world. Because in truth, the story of the Anunnaki did not re-enter our age all at once. It seeped in, softly, carefully, the way water moves through the smallest cracks, until one day the entire landscape has quietly changed. And as people listened to these rediscovered myths, something subtle began to unfold. They started to wonder, not just who the Anunnaki were, but why the first civilization built its entire worldview around them, not through fear, not through worship alone, but through a calm certainty that the universe had an order and that the Anunnaki stood within that order, like steady pillars holding up the sky. This curiosity became the quiet thread that pulled people deeper into the ancient world. At first, only scholars and historians spoke of these old stories. They examined tablets under museum lights and dusted fragments with careful hands. But gradually, the myths slipped out of academic halls into the wider world. Someone would mention an old tale in a conversation. A documentary would include a short passage. A book would devote a few lines to the strange council of gods the Sumerians believed in. These little moments were like embers, soft glows that, over time, became small flames. People began to ask, why did the earliest writers describe a universe governed by deliberation, not chaos? Why did they speak of councils instead of thrones? Why did they place such importance on law, order, and rhythm? It didn't matter whether listeners believed the myths literally. What mattered was the quiet fascination, the feeling of brushing against something older than memory itself. And in this fascination, the Anunnaki became something new, not gods, not rulers, but a doorway into the deepest past, into a version of humanity, trying for the first time to understand the shape of reality. Modern listeners found comfort in that vision, in the idea that long before skyscrapers and machines and digital screens, people paused in the quiet of the evening to wonder about the same things we still wonder about today. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What holds the world together when everything seems to fall apart? The Anunnaki became symbols of that ancient search. As this quiet revival spread, something else began to happen, almost invisible at first, but steady. People began looking for patterns, not in religion, but in their own lives. The ancient belief in cosmic order sparked a modern reflection. What is the rhythm of my own life? What anchors me when the world grows noisy? What do I return to when everything feels scattered? For some, the answer came from meditation. For others, from journaling, from breathwork, from simply sitting in silence and letting the mind settle. And each of these quiet practices felt strangely similar to what ancient priests once did on the steps of a ziggurat at dawn, because at its heart, the Mesopotamian worldview was not about worship as much as it was about alignment. Alignment with seasons, alignment with cycles, alignment with the slow turning of the world beneath the stars. Listeners today felt drawn to that idea, not because they sought deities, but because they sought stillness, a stillness that the ancient stories carried effortlessly across 5,000 years. As the myths continued to spread, a new kind of storyteller emerged, not a priest, not a scholar, but a narrator, someone who speaks with a calm voice, slow and steady, guiding listeners through the dust of forgotten cities and down the long corridors of ancient temples, through videos, podcasts, audiobooks, and whispered recordings meant for sleep. The story of the Anunnaki found a new shape, not dramatic, not sensational, but soothing, a way of stepping out of the noise for a few minutes, a way of touching a world that moved more slowly, more gently, more thoughtfully, a world where even creation was a quiet act. As the years passed, this soft revival deepened. People began to read the old hymns and tablets, not for answers, but for perspective. Some found comfort in the idea that humanity has always lived between order and chaos, that the tension between the two is not a modern burden, but an ancient truth. Others found comfort in the rhythm of the old stories, in their slow unfolding, in the repeated patterns, in the calm certainty that everything in the world moves according to cycles. Cycles of day and night, cycles of flood and drought, cycles of rise and fall, cycles of breath and sleep. These cycles became a quiet reassurance in the minds of listeners, a reminder that nothing is final, nothing is fixed, and nothing remains loud forever. Even storms pass, even chaos softens, even confusion settles into clarity. This was the ancient wisdom, woven into the stories of the Anunnaki, and now, gently, it was becoming part of the modern world again. Eventually, the myths of the Anunnaki became something even simpler. They became a way for people to return to themselves, not through belief, not through doctrine, but through stillness, a stillness that whispers gently beneath the surface of the story, a reminder of continuity, of connection, of the long thread of humanity, stretching back through ages and ages to the very dawn of recorded time, a thread that remains unbroken every time someone listens to these ancient tales in the quiet hours before sleep. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle of the Anunnaki's return. They no longer shape kings or cities or empires. They shape moments, small, private, peaceful moments in which the mind remembers that it is part of something much older and much calmer than the world we see today. Moments in which the oldest stories on earth become a lullaby for the modern heart. Moments in which myth becomes rest And as these ancient stories began weaving themselves quietly into modern life, a new understanding took shape. Not loud, not dramatic, but soft, like a candle slowly brightening a darkened room. People realized that the power of the Anunnaki was never in their feats, never in their authority, never in the grand myths that surrounded their names. It was in the calmness of their world, in the steadiness of their order, in the patience of their stories. For in a civilization as old as Sumer, life was not rushed, decisions were not hurried. Even the motions of the heavens were watched with quiet reverence, as though every star moved with purpose. And in this slow-moving cosmos, the Anunnaki were the steady guardians of a rhythm older than history itself. That rhythm, once felt only by farmers beneath dawnlight and priests waiting for the first winds of morning, has returned again to the ears of modern people, seeking something gentle in a loud and restless age. In late hours, when houses grow quiet and only the soft hum of nighttime remains, listeners press play on a whispered narration about forgotten gods and lost civilizations, not to learn, not to search for proof, but to rest, because the story of the Anunnaki is not only a window into the past, it is a mirror for the present, reflecting a truth the ancients understood intuitively. That meaning is found not in noise, but in stillness, not in answers, but in wonder, not in certainty, but in the slow unfolding of the human journey. And so the myths, once carved into clay and carried across deserts, in baskets and satchels, now drift through headphones and quiet rooms, filling the drifting mind with the same soft awe felt by people who lived thousands of years ago. As this quiet fascination deepened, another shift occurred, not in belief, but in perception. Listeners began to understand that myths endure because they carry emotional truth even when their literal meaning is forgotten. The Anunnaki, in their ancient role, were guardians of cosmic order, but in their modern retelling, they have become guardians of emotional order. They remind the restless mind that life is not meant to be controlled, only understood. They remind the anxious heart that cycles of chaos and calm are natural, eternal, inescapable. They remind the weary that everything in existence, from the rise of cities to the beating of a heart, follows a rhythm. And this reminder, spoken softly in a calm voice, has become a kind of medicine for modern listeners who fall asleep, not to escape the world, but to feel connected to something older and more enduring than their own worries. Over time, people began to see the Anunnaki not as ancient beings, but as symbols of the human need to locate ourselves within something greater. Some listeners imagine the slow construction of ziggurats at sunrise. Others picture scribes etching careful signs into wet clay. Others feel the gentle breath of warm winds moving through reeds. Beside the Euphrates, these images linger as the body grows still and the edges of consciousness begin to soften. For in these moments, the ancient world feels close, not in a literal sense, but in an emotional one. The cities may have crumbled, the temples may have disappeared, the language may have fallen silent, but the feeling remains, a feeling of continuity, a feeling of belonging, a feeling that the human story did not begin with us, but with those who looked at the same stars and found comfort in the same rhythms. As the myths drift further into the modern imagination, they become quiet companions, soft presences that echo in the spaces between thoughts. Late at night, when someone lies awake under a soft blanket, thinking about their life, their choices, their place in the world, the stories rise gently, like a calm tide, the Anunnaki balancing the universe, the cycles unfolding, the seasons turning, the stars drifting through predictable paths. These ancient images offer a quiet reassurance. Everything has a pattern, everything has a place, everything moves in its time. And in that realization, something inside the listener loosens, a tension releases, a breath deepens, A sense of calm settles. The modern world rushes. The ancient world waited. And the story of the Anunnaki reminds people that they too can slow down. Eventually, the myths of the Anunnaki become less about gods and more about the listener. They become a gentle space in which the mind can rest. They become a rhythm that syncs with breathing. Slow, steady, soothing. They become a bridge between waking and dreaming, between thought and quiet, between the ancient and the now. And as this bridge forms, a new kind of presence emerges. Not the presence of deities, but the presence of peace. For peace is what the ancient stories have always carried, hidden within their layers. Like soft petals inside a stone, peace in cycles, peace in order, peace in accepting that the cosmos is vast and life is small, and both truths are beautiful. And so, as the world gets louder, the myths become softer. As life grows more complex, the stories grow more simple. As people seek rest, the ancient rhythms rise to meet them. The Anunnaki do not command belief. They do not demand devotion. They offer something gentler, a place to breathe, a place to feel connected to the long, unbroken line of human curiosity, a place to drift into sleep with the comfort that the universe, in all its mystery, has always moved to an ancient steady rhythm, a rhythm that whispers softly through every retelling of these old stories, a rhythm that settles the heart, a rhythm that guides the breath, a rhythm that carries the listener slowly, gently, peacefully into rest. They do not leave us with answers. They leave us with echoes, soft echoes, the kind that linger long after the last words fade, the kind that remain even when the story seems complete, the kind that settle quietly into the spaces of the mind, where questions wait in silence. For the story of the Anunnaki does not end with revelation or certainty. It ends the way all ancient stories end, with an opening, a quiet door left slightly ajar, inviting the listener to step through, not into myth, but into themselves, as the final fragments of their world drift toward us. Across 5,000 years of forgotten dust, we begin to understand that the myths were never truly about gods at all. They were about humanity, about the way we search for meaning, in the spaces between stars, in the rise and fall of rivers, in the quiet turning of the seasons. And this understanding does not strike suddenly. It arrives like twilight, slow, gentle, spreading across the mind, until everything is washed in a soft, reflective glow. The ancient scribes, working by lamplight, in temples built of clay and devotion, were not trying to impress us with tales of power or fear. They were trying to articulate the feeling of being alive in a world that seemed both fragile and eternal. They wrote about councils of gods because they saw councils in their own cities. They wrote about cosmic order because they lived in a land where a single flood could either nourish a civilization or erase it overnight. They wrote about fate because fate was all around them, in harvests, in storms, in the quiet uncertainty of each new year. As we drift deeper into the final echoes of their world, we sense something familiar, a truth that belongs to them and to us. We too search for meaning in patterns we cannot fully see. We too try to understand our place between the vastness of time and the smallness of our lives. We too feel the pull of the unknown, a quiet force drawing us toward questions older than memory. The Anunnaki become, in this way, not figures of mythology, but reflections of the human mind. They represent the earliest attempt to map the invisible, to create a bridge between what we know and what we long to understand. This is why the myths linger, not because we believe every detail, but because the emotions they carry still live inside us. Curiosity, wonder, longing, fear, hope. These are the true ancient beings, the ones that never die, the ones that reappear in every civilization, in every age, under different names, different stories, different symbols. The Anunnaki are simply one of the earliest mirrors ever held up to the human spirit. And as we sit with their story, in the quiet hours before sleep, something inside us recognizes this. Not with words, but with a slow calming of the breath, a softening of the shoulders, a settling of the heart. It is the recognition that we are part of a long, unbroken journey, stretching back through ages we can barely imagine, a journey filled with millions of lives, asking the same questions we ask now. What guides the world? What shapes our destiny? Why are we here? Where do we go? What lies beyond? The Anunnaki do not give us answers. They give us a frame, a shape, a gentle structure within which the questions can rest. Instead of overwhelm, the Sumerians imagined the universe as a vast, steady architecture. Every star was placed with purpose. Every river flowed according to a quiet design. Every life rose and fell within an ancient rhythm, older than any god's name. That worldview, soft as it seems, carries a deep comfort. It tells us that chaos is not absolute, that disorder is temporary, that existence, beneath the noise, moves according to patterns that have endured since the first dawn. It tells us that meaning does not vanish just because our cities crumble or our stories fade. Meaning survives in the way people remember, in the way they retell, in the way they reflect. This is the gentle truth. The Anunnaki leave us that civilizations are temporary, but the longing to understand is eternal. That myths rise and fall, but the questions behind them continue forward, quietly, patiently, like a river that remembers its path, even after the land around it changes. And so, as we sit with the last echoes of their world, we begin to understand that the story was never about them. It was about us, about what survives. After the temples collapse, after the tablets crumble, after the languages turn to dust, what survives is the desire to make sense of existence. What survives is the human need to connect our brief lives to something vast and enduring. What survives is the quiet comfort of knowing that we are not the first to stand beneath the night sky and wonder. As the myths dissolve into their softest form, we feel their final whisper that the universe is not indifferent, not empty, not cold. It is patterned, it is rhythmic, it is old, older than gods, older than myths, older than memory. And in that pattern, we find our place, not as rulers, not as observers, but as part of the gentle movement that carries all things, from beginning to end, and from end to beginning. The Anunnaki, in their last gift to us, teach us how to listen to that movement, not with the mind, but with the soul, not with logic, but with stillness, not with fear, but with the calm acceptance that we are woven into something ancient and vast and beautifully ordered. And so, as the story closes, we realize that its closing is not an ending, but a soft unfolding, a quiet invitation to let the mind rest in wonder instead of worry, to let the breath follow the slow rhythm of the universe, to let the heart settle into the gentle truth that we are part of a story much older than ourselves. This, more than anything, is the final resonance of the Anunnaki, not the gods, not the myths, not the temples, but the feeling that beneath everything there is a stillness holding the world together, a stillness you can hear if you listen closely enough, a stillness that remains even after the last word fades, a stillness that follows you into sleep, and in that sleep the ancient rhythm continues, soft, endless, eternal, carrying you gently through the quiet of the night. And yet, even as the last echoes fade, something remains, a quiet warmth, like the lingering glow after a lamp has been extinguished, still holding the shape of its light. Because the story of the Anunnaki does not stay behind in the ancient world. It moves forward with us, gently, softly, the way memories travel in dreams, shifting shape, but never disappearing. Long after the tablets crumble, long after the priests walk their final dawn, long after the river changes its course again, the essence of the story continues, in every place where humans pause. To reflect, to wonder, to breathe. It continues. When someone stands alone beneath a quiet sky and feels the weight of the stars settling into their thoughts, it continues. Whenever a person sits by a window at night, listening to the soft wind, feeling something vast and wordless, moving through the darkness, it continues. In the shared silence, between two people who both sense that life is more fragile and more precious than they ever knew. The Anunnaki remain not as figures, but as a feeling that the universe is layered with meaning, so subtle you can only sense it. When the world grows quiet, a feeling that the earliest humans were not so different from us, that they too carried hopes and doubts that drifted through their minds as gently as clouds across an early dawn. In this way, the story becomes a bridge between their world and ours, a bridge built not of stone, or myth, or belief, but of something far more enduring, the shared human longing to understand the invisible architecture holding everything together. As we sit in the stillness, their story leaves behind. It becomes easier to see how each generation adds its own layer to the ancient search. Sumerians looked to the rivers, watching the quiet rise and fall of their waters. Babylonians looked to the sky, measuring the movement of stars with patient eyes. Assyrians looked to the horizon, listening to the wind that carried the breath of many empires. And we look inward, not because the universe is smaller now, but because the noise outside often hides the patterns within. As the modern world rushes forward, with its bright screens, its restless roads, its constant chatter, something deep within us begins to crave what the ancient world never lost, the gentle reassurance that life is part of a rhythm older than any fear. We begin to crave the steady tempo beneath the turbulence of our days, the quiet heartbeat beneath the uncertainty of our choices, the soft order beneath the spinning of the world. And so, the story of the Anunnaki offers not answers, but a place to rest, a place where the mind's edges soften, where the breath deepens, where the weight of questions no longer presses down, but simply drifts alongside us, like shadows moving across warm sand. It becomes a reminder that mystery is not something to escape, it is something to embrace, for mystery is the gentle dark in which meaning grows. It is the space that allows us to imagine, to seek, to dream. When the ancient scribes pressed their stories into clay, they were giving shape to the mystery that lived inside them. They did not expect the tablets to last forever. They did not expect us to read their words 5,000 years later. What they wanted was to leave behind a thread, a small, quiet, fragile thread that could be followed by anyone who ever felt what they felt, that invisible pull toward understanding. And now, in the quiet of this moment, you hold that thread, not physically, but in your awareness, in the softness settling over you as the story unfolds, in the gentleness that comes when the mind is guided into a place without urgency, without pressure, without fear. You can almost feel the ancient calm beneath your thoughts, the calm of a world where people moved slowly, spoke softly, and viewed existence, not as chaos, but as a delicate arrangement of cycles and seasons. The calm of a world where time flowed, like a river without haste, and where life was lived, with a reverence that came naturally, from recognizing the fragility of all things. And as that calm settles deeper, you begin to see that this story, this long, meandering journey, through temples and myths, through cities and stars, through vanished ages, was never truly about learning anything at all. It was about slowing. It was about breathing. It was about returning your mind to a quieter rhythm, one that the ancient world knew intimately and that the modern world often forgets. The Anunnaki, in their final form, become symbols not of power, but of pace. They teach us that the universe does not rush, that meaning does not shout, that wisdom arrives only when we become still enough to hear it, and in that stillness, another awareness blooms, soft, delicate, almost like the touch of a distant memory. It is the awareness that you, too, are part of an ancient pattern, your breath, your sleep, your dreams, your quiet longing to understand the world. All of it is woven into the same tapestry that held the prayers of Sumerian priests and the stories whispered by Babylonian mothers to their children at dusk. You are not outside the ancient story. You are within it, another thread in the long fabric of humanity. And as the night gathers around you, as the words soften, as your thoughts grow slower, that thread grows warm, a reminder that you are connected to every dawn that ever rose, every star that ever shone, every question that ever trembled in the human heart. And now, as you drift towards sleep, the story settles into its quietest form, no longer a tale, but a feeling that the world is older, softer, and more patient than we often realize. A feeling that whatever tomorrow brings, there is a rhythm beneath it, holding you gently, the way the ancient world once held its people. A feeling that you can rest, and so you do, slowly, softly, deeply, carried, as the Sumerians once were, on the quiet, steady breath of a universe that never stops whispering, even now, even here, even in the silent dark that leads you into sleep